When I was a teenager, two things happened in my hometown. The first was they opened up the bypass around Cincinnati. It's called 275. And my little town, hometown of Milford, was an exit off of 275. And then the second more impressive thing that happened was they opened up an amusement park just up 275 from where I lived called Kings Island. Well, one day, some friends of mine, we had just turned 16, I think. Really had just gotten our license. Um, we decided we were going to go to Kings Island. There was three or four of us, and a friend of mine, Gary, was driving. And we spent the day at Kings Island, and we had a very good time. When we got done, we, found our way out of the park, out of the parking lot, and back to 275. But while we were joking and laughing and having a good time, instead of going in the direction towards our exit, which was about 15 to 20 minutes, we went the wrong way. We headed in the wrong direction on 275. Now, to go completely around the bypass, if I remember, I took about an hour and 15 minutes. So about a half hour into our trip home, we realized that we weren't anywhere going close to home. In fact, we realized that we had headed in the wrong direction. So we just continued on and did the whole bypass, and then finally, turned our 20-minute trip into about an hour and a half trip. But the truth is, we were having a good time. We didn't really care that we were lost. We didn't really care that we were headed in the wrong direction. I often think of that story when I think of Luke chapter 15. Now, this week we're going to continue our study of Luke, and we're going to pick it up where we left off in Luke 15. And Luke 15 is primarily known as the parable of the prodigal son. The parable of the prodigal son. When we look at it for Sunday's sermon, I'm actually going to look at not the younger son, the prodigal, but his brother, the older brother. In fact, I'm going to call it the prodigal brother. But since I'm going to concentrate on the prodigal brother, the older brother, I thought that I'd do a little supplemental lesson. If we were under our normal schedule, this would have been my Sunday school lesson. But I thought I'd do a little supplemental lesson about the prodigal son, kind of in preparation for our look at the prodigal brother. And what I call this lesson is Lost and Loving It. Lost and Loving It. Turn to Luke 15, verse number 11. Luke 15, verse number 11. And he, Jesus, said, a man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me. So he divided his wealth between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living. Sometimes knowing the end of a story ruins its full effect. I wish we could interview this man, this younger brother, at the end of verse 13 and talk to him at the end of verse 13. I think we will learn some very interesting things. I think in verse 13, we can safely say he was lost and loving it. He was, as the King James says, I believe, involved in riotous living. He was having a riot. He was loving his life. He had money. He was young. He had no constraints. He had no one telling him what to do. He was having the time of his life. And I think this story teaches some things that we need to realize. The first is being lost can be fun. Proverbs 14:12 says, "There is a way that seems right to man, but the end thereof is the way of death." But I want to talk about just for a minute the first part of that phrase. There's a way which seems right to man. He didn't think he was lost. He didn't feel he was lost. He felt he was right. Everything was right with the world. Money to burn, freedom, uh, no constraints, loose living. The New American Standard says, um, you know, he was lost and he was loving it. Sometimes we think, um, that lost people don't like their condition, that lost people feel lost. And to us Christians, we understand that they're lost, but they don't think they're lost. And it's very hard in verse 13 to convince a person that they need Jesus, that they need found, because at the moment they're lost and loving it. And I think this leads to some falsehoods that we have about lost people. Sometimes we think, and again, I grew up in a Christian home. I got saved as a 5-year-old kid. Um, you know, I was never the prodigal son. Uh, so I had a lot of misconceptions. But as I've gotten older and matured and understood life better and certainly understand the Bible better, there's a couple things I've realized that, first of all, that non-Christians aren't necessarily miserable. I think we, sometimes feel that non-Christians are miserable. Well, I guarantee you, in verse 13, miserable was not what this guy felt. And that's another thing. We think people are driven by felt needs, that they don't realize that they need what Christ has to offer. They need forgiveness, and they're haunted by, is there a God, and how do I find myself acceptable to God, and and is there such a thing as sin? I don't think they really contemplate that. Sometimes we think that they struggle with building meaningful relationships, but I'm sure at the time this guy thought he had meaningful relationships. Now, we realize that his friends, as long as he had money, he had friends. When his money ran out, so did his friends. But again, at the end of verse 13, in that moment, he thought he had meaningful relationships. Um, we think a lost person, there's nothing they can do to fill their empty lives with meaning. Well, again, I think he was doing a lot of things to fill his empty life with meaning. Um, Again, we think that they think about death and they fear dying. And granted, perhaps during this pandemic, this is a golden opportunity for the church, for Christians, for us. Because it may be that people are thinking about death more than usual, and they are fearful more than usual, and we can take advantage of that. But in normal times and in good times, I don't know that they're always thinking about that. Proverbs 10:23 says, "Doing wickedness is like a sport to a fool." Doing wickedness is like a sport to a fool. Again, their lifestyle, this loose living, is, as Jesus puts it in the parable. To them it's like a sport. They're enjoying. They're winning. They don't sit around thinking about being lost. They think that they're winners. They don't think about death. They think about life. They're not miserable. They're joyful. They're happy. Being lost can be fun. Just like me and my buddies coming home from Kings Island, we were headed in the opposite direction, but we were enjoying every minute of it. We laughed the whole way. Sin offers fun on credit. Have it now, pay me later. Hebrews 11:25 says, "Choosing rather to endure the ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin." That's, of course, talking about Moses. But that we can't overlook that phrase, the passing pleasures of sin. For a while, sin is fun. It's pleasurable. It offers fun on credit. Now, again, they're the passing pleasures because they run out. And obviously, part of the moral of the parable here with the prodigal son is it did run out, but at first it didn't. So we find that people's lives have seasons, and time will provide an opportunity to win them. In fact, I think here you could say here's one effective means of evangelism. It's waiting for the now. Okay, look at verse 13 and verse 14. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now, verse 14, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. Now, look at the word now. Now makes all the difference. Then, while he had money, he was lost in loving it. But now he's come to his senses. And one method of evangelism is to wait for the now. So for many people, we have to wait for the now. And again, maybe with this pandemic, this is the now for many people. Okay. But while you're waiting for the now, you need to build credibility. While you're waiting for your prodigal son, okay, while you're waiting for that lost loved one or lost coworker or lost neighbor, you need to build credibility so that when the now comes, they'll start thinking like verse 15. Verse 17. But when he came to his senses, okay, so when he comes to his senses, now he knew he could go back to his father because his father had not lost his credibility. So, number one, being lost can be fun. Number two, nobody gets lost on purpose. Nobody gets lost on purpose. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, "For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, for longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." But the key phrase there is, many have wandered away from the faith. They wandered away from the faith. They didn't get lost on purpose per se. They just got their eyes on something else. Again, I'm not the only person I don't think that ever got lost while driving, right? I'm sure you've gotten lost while driving. How did it happen? Well, you just got on the wrong exit. You headed in the wrong direction, but you didn't do it on purpose. It's like the story of the little boy in the grocery store. He was with his mom, and his mom's in the aisle, and he sees a shiny toy up a little bit further, and he wanders around. He finds that toy, and there's a whole toy aisle, and pretty soon he's gone down the other aisle, and there's more toys. And before he knows it, he doesn't know where mom is, and mom doesn't know where he is. And finally, mom finds him in the toy aisle, and she scolds him and says, what are you doing? Where'd you go? Don't wander off. He goes, well, Mom, I didn't get lost on purpose. I didn't get lost on purpose. The prodigal sincerely thought he was doing the right thing for him. He was doing the right thing for him. But he miscalculated. He got lost, but it wasn't on purpose. I mean, it's easy to get lost. Matthew 7:13. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. So the gate is wide. It's very easy to go through the wide gate. It's difficult to go through the narrow gate. We get lost because it's easy. It's hard to go the correct way. Bad things happen to you automatically unless you take specific steps to prevent them from happening, right? When we remember how easy it is to get lost, this will help us guard against judging them too harshly. So let's not judge them too harshly. It's easy to get lost. Broad is the way. You can be lost and not know it. Matthew 7:21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. They were lost and didn't know it. The prodigal had made a wrong turn the minute he went out his front door, and he got progressively more lost, but he didn't know it. Again, you could be lost and loving it. You could be lost and be having fun. It doesn't mean that you've chosen it on purpose. It's the easy way, but it's still the wrong way. Now here's another problem. This is why I say that one effective means of evangelism is to wait for the now, because you cannot force people to admit they are lost. You cannot force people to admit they are lost. Acts 7:51 says, "You men who are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears are always uncircumcised in heart and ears are always resisting the Holy Spirit. You are doing just as your fathers did." Listen, people are stiff-necked. They don't listen. Let's go back to the illustration of driving a car for you married people. Wives, have your husbands ever gotten lost? Will he ever admit it? Men do not admit that they have gotten lost. How many times have I argued with the GPS and then ended up on the wrong exit or turned too soon or waited too long? You can't force people to admit they're lost. They have to realize it. Again, verse 17, but when he came to his senses. Again, the prodigal did not think. So if you come to verse 13, let me just reiterate. At the end of verse 13, this guy did not think he was lost. And if you had interviewed him in verse 13, he would never have admitted that he was lost because he didn't think he was lost. But if you wait for the now, you may get people to admit that they are lost. And that's the first step in the right direction. Verse 17, but when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. So I think we have to watch for signs that indicate that people are beginning to admit that they are lost, are willing to admit they are lost. And there are signs. Here are some signs. There are other signs, but perhaps you notice that they began to have an interest in what the Bible says. You know, what answers do the Bible give? They begin to have questions about spiritual things. If there's a God, why is there evil? If there's a God, why is there a pandemic? If I'm afraid of dying, and you say God is the answer to my fear of dying, why did he cause people to die to start with? Maybe there's an interest in watching some of these videos, or saying, listen, when this is over, I'd like to go to church. Maybe they start to express a dissatisfaction with their way of life, the way they're living. Maybe they express that they'd sure like a chance to have a do-over, to start over. Maybe they start to regret decisions they've made in their past. When people are ready, they will ask for directions. You need to be prepared to give those directions to them.